They say there are moments so small you could almost miss them, and yet they can change an entire life. Nora, a woman in her 50s, had endured the sting of cruel words for years. They called her too old, left behind, a woman no man would ever want. In town, she was little more than a shadow spoken of in hushed tones, pitied at best, ridiculed at worst. People assumed her story was already over, that she would walk the rest of her days in silence and solitude. But what they never saw was the quiet dignity she carried. Behind those tired, steady eyes was a woman who had been forced into marriage once abandoned, another time mocked more times than she could count, and yet she had never stopped living kindly. She still baked bread for neighbors, still mended clothes for children who weren't her own, still believed somewhere deep down that even a broken road could lead to a place called home. Then on a day like any other, when whispers and laughter swirled around her like dust, something unexpected happened. A child no taller than her waist walked up to her. With eyes wide and voice trembling, the little one asked a question that pierced through years of shame. "Will you be my mama?" It was not pity. It was not mockery. It was a plea for belonging. And in that fragile plea, Nora felt something she thought she had lost forever: hope. In that instant, the cruel laughter of the crowd faded. What remained was the sound of her own heartbeat, steady and alive, as if reminding her that she still had chapters left to live. From that moment, everything began to change. But why did this child choose her, the woman mocked for being too old? And how could a single question stir courage in her heart enough to believe that love, family, and belonging might still find her after all these years? This is not just a story about ridicule turned into respect. It is about how a soul weathered by rejection can bloom again when touched by kindness. It is about a man who would later come to see Nora not as a burden, not as a shadow of someone younger, but as a woman of strength and tenderness, the very heart he didn't know he was waiting for. Sometimes all it takes is one whispered question to awaken a lifetime of love. Do you want to know what happens after Nora hears those words? The year was 1882, and the little town of Dry Creek had a way of remembering everything and forgetting nothing. Nora Hale, 50 years old, walked the same wooden sidewalk she had since her girlhood, only now with a back a little more bent and a silence heavier on her shoulders. Too old to marry, too late to dream, too strange to still hope. She heard the whispers the way one hears the wind scratching at window panes, always there, never gentle. But she never let them see her wince. Nora ran her small sewing corner in the back of the mercantile, stitching shirts for cowhands, hemming dresses for young brides who barely glanced her way. Each stitch was neat, precise, almost prayerful. It was how she kept her dignity thread by thread, quiet but unbroken. Once long ago, she had nearly been forced into a marriage she did not want. A man older, bitter, more interested in her dowry than her heart. One night she left his house before dawn, slipped off the ring he had pressed into her hand, and placed it on his kitchen table. She never returned. Since then, she had lived with the quiet conviction that sometimes survival itself was an act of courage. That spring afternoon, she carried a pot of soup to the train station. Travelers came hungry, dusty, and worn, and she found purpose in feeding them. The 4:10 train arrived late, groaning like an old beast. Out stepped Jonas Reed, a widower, with grief still clinging to his shoulders, and with him 2 small children. The youngest, a girl of maybe 6, tugged at his coat, her eyes wide and searching. When she saw Nora ladling soup with her strong, work-worn hands, she tilted her head and whispered, almost too soft to hear, "Will you be my mama?" The words pierced deeper than any insult the town had ever thrown her way. Nora froze her ladle dripping broth back into the pot. Jonas turned sharply, embarrassed, but the little girl kept looking at her as if she saw something no one else in Dry Creek ever had. Nora's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I'm just the one making soup, sweetheart," she said gently. But her heart throbbed like a door she thought had been locked forever. Suddenly nudged open. When the sun set that evening, Nora walked home alone, the child's question echoing inside her, louder than the gossip, louder even than the silence of her small rented room. For the first time in years, she felt something stirring like embers, deep in ash, waiting for breath. Sometimes the cruelest words are the ones we've learned to believe about ourselves. But what happens when a child's innocent whisper dares to call us by a new name? Do you want to continue? Jonas Reed hadn't planned to stay long in Dry Creek. The town was meant to be a resting stop before moving farther west, where land was still wild and cheap, and where he thought he might start again. But starting over was harder than he let on. His wife had died 2 winters before pneumonia, taking her in less than a week. Since then, he carried not only his children, but the crushing weight of all that was undone. The meals she would never cook, the lullabies left unfinished, the warmth he could never give in the same way. That day at the train station, when his youngest whispered to Nora, Jonas felt his chest tighten. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was the ache of knowing how empty his daughter's arms had been since her mother's passing. He muttered an apology, tipped his hat toward Nora, and led the children away. He expected never to see her again. But Dry Creek had a way of weaving lives together in quiet, unassuming threads. A week later, Jonas walked into the mercantile, his son clutching his hand. He needed flour, salt, and thread for mending his own shirt. Nora was at her sewing table, spectacles perched on her nose, her fingers moving with graceful precision. When she looked up and saw the children, her face softened in a way Jonas noticed instantly. "Your daughter?" Nora said carefully, folding a half-mended sleeve. "She's got eyes like spring water. Clear. Honest." Jonas nodded, caught off guard by her gentleness. Few people in town spoke to him beyond business, let alone with warmth. She misses her mama," he admitted, almost against his will. The boy piped up then. "Pa can't sew buttons." Jonas chuckled, a sound more weary than amused. "That's true enough." Nora's smile was faint but kind. "Leave it here. I'll fix it proper." She didn't ask for payment. She simply took the shirt, set it on her table, and threaded her needle. Jonas stood awkwardly, tipping his hat again, unsure why his throat felt tight. As the days passed, he found excuses to return. Sometimes it was flour. Sometimes it was nails. Once it was nothing at all, only the need for the sound of her voice. The children grew fond of sitting by her table, watching her hands work the needle, listening to the quiet hum she made without realizing. And Nora, though she told herself she was only helping, she felt a warmth she hadn't let herself feel in decades. Here was a man who carried sorrow, yes, but not cruelty. Here were children who looked at her without scorn, and in their company her room at night no longer felt so cold. Still, she knew better than to let hope take root too quickly. The world had a way of cutting down anything that dared to bloom late. Yet when Jonas lingered one evening, hat in his hand, and said, "You've been a kindness to us," Nora felt something stir that no gossip could reach. Sometimes reunion doesn't come with trumpets or grand declarations. It comes in the quiet return of someone you thought you'd never see again. But what happens when kindness begins to feel like belonging? Shall we continue? Nora had spent her life learning how to endure words. Some cut deep, some rolled off her like rain on stone, but all of them left marks in their own way. Too old, too plain, too late. She had gathered those phrases like burrs on her skirt, never asking for them, never deserving them, but carrying them all the same. So when whispers began in Dry Creek about Jonas Reed spending too much time at the seamstress's table, it was not unfamiliar. A few of the younger women at the mercantile smirked openly, nudging one another when Jonas came in. "Imagine him settling for her," one muttered, not quietly enough. "Can't even get a wife his own age," Nora heard. She always heard, but she didn't let her needle falter. The stitch line remained steady, though her heart thudded unevenly in her chest. Jonas, for his part, didn't seem to notice at first. His children tugged at his sleeve, asking if they could sit by Miss Nora's window, and he simply smiled, granting them their wish. But later on the walk home, Jonas caught the look in one man's eye, a smirk that carried a sting. "She's past her prime," the man chuckled to his friend, "but I suppose beggars can't be choosers." Jonas stopped cold. His jaw tightened. For a moment he considered turning back, but his little boy's hand in his own stilled him. The boy looked up, eyes wide, and Jonas knew he could not teach his children that cruelty deserved their attention. Instead, he kept walking, but the words sat in his chest like coals. That night, Nora sat by her lamp, finishing the last seam on Jonas's shirt. The button glinted in the dim light, polished smooth. She thought of how the children's laughter had filled her shop earlier that day, how Jonas's voice had softened when he thanked her. And then she thought of the whispers, the laughter behind her back. She pressed her fingers hard against the fabric, as though she could stitch her heart shut with the same care. Jonas came by the next morning to collect the shirt. He saw the faint weariness in her face, the way her smile trembled before settling. He didn't take the shirt right away. Instead, he asked quietly, "What did they say?" Nora looked down. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me," he replied, voice low, steady the way a man speaks when he has no patience left for lies. She hesitated. Then with a sigh that felt like surrender, she whispered, "They say you could do better than me, that I'm too old, too worn for anyone to want." The silence after was thick as prairie fog. Jonas stared at her, his hand flexing at his side. Finally he said, "You are not too old. You are not too worn. And if they cannot see the worth in you, then that's their blindness, not yours." Nora swallowed hard, her eyes burning, but she could not let herself believe so quickly. "Words linger," she said softly, "even when we try not to let them." Jonas nodded slowly. "Then let me show you something stronger than words." The days that followed were not easy. The town's chatter grew louder, as small towns often feed on stories more than truth. Children repeated what they overheard at home, their voices cruel without understanding. "Old maid," one boy shouted when Nora passed. His mother hushed him, but not quickly enough. Yet Jonas kept returning. Each visit was a quiet rebellion. Each loaf of bread Nora shared with his children, each sleeve she mended, each wordless glance across the counter, these became their defense against gossip. But even strong hearts can falter. One evening, as Nora was closing her shop, Jonas lingered longer than usual. He looked tired, worn not just by the day's labor, but by something deeper. "They're right about one thing," he said suddenly. Nora froze, her breath caught. "They say I'm a fool." He looked at her, then eyes dark but steady. "And I am. A fool for not seeing sooner what my children already know, that we need you. Not as a seamstress, not as charity, as part of us." Her throat tightened. "Jonas," he shook his head, "I'm not asking for an answer tonight, but I can't stand by while they tear at your dignity. You are more than their words. You are more than what was done to you before." That night, Nora lay awake staring at the low ceiling of her room. Memories pressed against her, men who dismissed her, a life where her worth was measured by her youth, her beauty, her ability to bear children. And now here was Jonas, a man with grief carved into his face, telling her she was not just enough, but needed. It was almost too much to believe. Hope for someone like her had always been a dangerous thing. Yet she could not ignore the way her heart stirred when the children slipped their small hands into hers, or the way Jonas's voice gentled when he spoke her name. Still, fear gnawed at her. What if he only came because of loneliness? What if she was nothing more than a shadow of what he had lost? Her hand curled against the quilt. The stitches there were hers, her work, her care. She was not a shadow. She was Nora. And maybe, just maybe, she was worth choosing. Gossip can wound deeper than bullets, especially when it strikes an already scarred heart. But when one man dares to stand against it, when he calls her needed instead of burden, is that the beginning of love, or just another illusion waiting to break? Do you want to hear what happens next? The wind rattled the windows of Dry Creek like a restless spirit. It was the kind of night when the prairie seemed to whisper all the things a heart tried not to hear. Nora sat by her lamp thread, trembling between her fingers. The needle refused to move, steady, her hand faltering, as her mind circled back to Jonas's words. "You are needed." It had been 3 days since he'd said it. 3 days since he had looked at her, with that quiet intensity, as if daring her to believe she was more than what the town whispered. She wanted to believe. God help her, she wanted to. But words, kind or cruel, were slippery things. They clung to memory long after voices faded. Earlier that afternoon, she'd gone to fetch flour. The mercantile was busy, men stomping snow from their boots, women gossiping as they gathered sugar and lamp oil. Nora had felt every eye on her the moment she stepped inside. A woman near the spice barrels tilted her head toward Nora and muttered, "Imagine him saddling himself with that old spinster. She'll wither before the children grow." The laughter had been muffled, but it carried. Nora's back straightened, her jaw tightened, and she carried her flour with the dignity of a queen. She said nothing, not then. But by the time she reached her shop, her composure cracked. She leaned against the counter, breath shuddering, tears burning hot but unspilled. she had spent half a lifetime enduring. Why now did their words cut so deep? Perhaps because, for the first time, she wanted something more. She wanted to be chosen, not tolerated, not pitied. Chosen. Jonas came by just before dusk. His children darted inside their laughter like birdsong. They showed her a crude snowman they had built, boasting about how they used carrot tops for the nose. Nora smiled, warming them by the stove, but her eyes avoided Jonas's. He noticed. He always noticed. When the children settled with mugs of cider, he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Who hurt you today?" She stiffened. "Why do you think someone did?" "Because your smile doesn't reach your eyes." Her lips trembled. "Does it matter? They only say what everyone has always thought. That I am too old, too late, too—" "Stop!" Jonas's voice cut sharper than she'd ever heard it. His hand tightened on the chair back, knuckles pale. "You don't owe their words another breath." She turned on him, anger flaring. "Easy for you to say, Jonas Reed. You've never lived a life being dismissed before you even opened your mouth. You lost a wife, yes, but you were loved first. Me, I've been nothing more than the joke at the end of the street. Even now, people look at you and wonder why you would waste your time with me." Her words hung between them, raw as an open wound. Jonas's chest rose and fell, his jaw clenched. For a long moment he said nothing. Then softly he asked, "Do you think I'm here out of pity?" Nora's breath caught. He stepped closer, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear. "I have no patience for lies, Nora. Not from them and not from you. If you truly believe I'm here because I pity you, then say it. Look me in the eye and say it." Her gaze faltered. She couldn't. Not because she didn't fear it, but because deep down she knew it wasn't true. His kindness wasn't charity. It was something steadier, something she had never learned how to accept. Her throat ached. "I don't know what to believe," she whispered. Jonas exhaled, his shoulders softening. "Then believe what you see. Believe the way my children cling to you like you've always been theirs. Believe the way I look forward to your lamplight at the end of the day. Believe that when I hear their gossip, it makes me want to tear down every word until nothing's left but the truth." Her tears slipped free, then unbidden. Jonas didn't reach for her, not yet. He stood steady, letting her cry without shame. It was the first time in years she'd cried in front of anyone, and she realized, strange as it was, that she felt safe doing so. But the town wasn't finished. 2 nights later, Jonas came to her door with a bruise on his cheekbone. His children trailed behind, wide-eyed and silent. "What happened?" she gasped. He brushed it off at first, but under her steady gaze, he admitted, "A man at the saloon said your name. He thought it was funny. I didn't." Nora's hand flew to her mouth. "Jonas!" "I don't regret it," he said firmly, though his eyes held a flicker of shame. "But it's clear they won't stop until we show them they can't tear us down." Her heart pounded. "We—" The word lodged inside her chest like a spark. That night, after the children fell asleep near her hearth, Nora sat across from Jonas. The lamplight softened the hard lines of his face. His bruise darkened, but his eyes were gentle. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," she confessed, her voice breaking. Jonas leaned forward. "Then let me be strong for the both of us until you believe you are." The words wrapped around her like a quilt in winter. For the first time, Nora didn't feel like a burden. She felt wanted. Yet even as hope flickered, doubt lingered like shadow. Could she truly let herself believe? Or would stepping forward only bring more pain? The bruises on Jonas's face were nothing compared to the scars Nora carried in her heart. But now that he has stood up for her before the whole town, will she finally allow herself to step out of the shadows and into a love she never thought was hers to claim? Snow still lingered on the rooftops of Dry Creek, though spring threatened at the edges of the horizon. The days stretched longer, the air carried the faint smell of thawing earth, and yet Nora felt the cold inside her bones, as if winter refused to release its grip. After Jonas's fight at the saloon, whispers had grown sharper. She could hear them even when she wasn't near, saw the way heads tilted, the way eyes darted when she passed. Some folks admired Jonas's loyalty, but others said he was a fool. And the cruelest words, the ones Nora couldn't shake, were always the same. "She's too old. Too late. He'll regret it." One morning she found a note pinned to her shop door in uneven handwriting. "Leave before you shame him further." Her hands trembled as she pulled it free, folding it into her apron. She didn't show Jonas. She couldn't. To tell him would mean admitting she feared they might be right. That evening, Jonas arrived with his children. The girls' cheeks glowed pink from the cold, their laughter filling the room. They ran to show Nora a drawing stick figures, holding hands beneath a roof, the word family scribbled above in crooked letters. Nora's throat tightened. She smoothed the paper with her fingers as if it were a sacred thing. "This is beautiful," she whispered. The youngest looked up with wide, trusting eyes. "We put you in the middle because you're holding us together." The words broke something inside her. She turned away quickly, blinking against tears. She had wanted her whole life to be seen this way, not as a burden, but as belonging. Yet belonging came with a cost, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to keep paying it. That night after the children slept, Jonas lingered by the fire. The silence stretched between them until finally he spoke. "You've been quieter lately," he said softly. Nora busied her hands with knitting. "I've just been tired." Jonas didn't accept the excuse. He moved closer, sitting across from her, eyes steady. "I know the look of someone carrying words they're afraid to speak. You've been carrying them too long, Nora. Don't let them rot inside you." She wanted to tell him about the note, about the whispers, about the ache of always feeling less than. But the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she whispered, "I don't want to ruin your life." Jonas leaned forward, his voice low and sure. "You could never ruin my life. Nora, you're the only reason it feels like one again." Her eyes stung. The knitting slid from her lap. "But the town, let the town talk." He set his tone firm. "They've talked my whole life. They talked when I married young. They talked when I buried her. And they'll keep talking until I'm in the ground. I don't give them my happiness to feed their tongues." For a long moment she couldn't breathe. His words were like warm light pressing through cracks in her doubt. But doubt wasn't so easily banished. The very next day she overheard two men at the well. "Reed's lost his mind," one muttered. "Maybe loneliness makes a man settle for less," the other replied. Their laughter carried across the square. Nora froze, bucket in hand. She wanted to march up to defend herself, but years of being silenced held her tongue. Instead, she lowered her gaze and walked away, each step heavier than the last. That night, Jonas came again, but Nora avoided his eyes. She set supper on the table, ate in silence, and excused herself early. Alone in her room, she stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. 50 years old, lines carved around her eyes, hair streaked with gray, skin weathered by sun and sorrow. She touched the reflection as if trying to see herself through Jonas's eyes instead of her own. Could love truly bloom this late, or was she fooling herself with borrowed warmth? Her tears fell silently. The breaking point came 2 nights later. Jonas arrived late, his children already asleep. He carried a basket of mended clothes she had done for them, his eyes tired but tender. She thanked him, but her voice was flat. He set the basket down, studied her carefully. "Nora, if you mean to push me away, just say so. Don't bleed me with silence." Her body shook. "I'm not pushing you away, Jonas. I'm trying not to drown you with me." The words burst out raw and loud, echoing through the small house. She pressed her fist to her eyes, sobs spilling free. "I can't bear it if you wake up one morning and see what they see, that I am nothing but a mistake you made, because you were lonely." The room went deathly quiet. Her sobs filled the space where his reply should have been. When she dared to look, Jonas's eyes were wet. He crossed the room slow and deliberate and took her face in his calloused hands. "Do you think loneliness would make me fight for you? Do you think loneliness would make my daughters draw us together as family? Loneliness breaks a man down, Nora. But you," his voice cracked, "you built me back up." Her breath hitched. He rested his forehead against hers, whispering, "Don't believe the voices that never mattered. Believe the life we're building. Believe me." For the first time, she let herself lean into him, fully trembling, but unresisting. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was healing. Nora had carried a lifetime of rejection, like chains around her heart. But now Jonas's words had cracked something open. Would she finally trust that love could be chosen, and that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for her after all? Spring came slowly to Dry Creek. The last of the snow melted into the earth, feeding streams that sang low through the valley. Wildflowers began to push their way up through the stubborn soil, little bursts of color against the faded brown of the prairie. Nora watched them from her porch one morning, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and thought how much they reminded her of herself, weathered by frost but still daring to bloom. Jonas had not spoken again of her outburst that night. Instead, he simply showed up steady as always. He brought kindling for her stove, mended a broken shutter, taught her how to repair a fence post. He asked nothing in return, not even her smile, but she found herself offering it anyway. And yet inside the struggle remained. Trusting him meant lowering walls she had built over decades, walls that had once been the only thing keeping her safe. One afternoon, Nora went into town for flour. Whispers met her as usual, but this time she noticed something different. Mrs. Calloway, a widow with 4 children, tipped her hat with a small smile. Later, young Samuel Harper, barely 12, offered to carry her basket. Nora was startled. Was it pity, or had something shifted? When she returned to her porch, Jonas was waiting. He noticed her thoughtful silence. "What's stirring in your mind?" She hesitated, then admitted softly. Maybe, maybe not everyone sees me as they once did." Jonas's eyes softened. "That's because they're starting to see what I've seen all along." Her breath caught. No flowery words, no grand promises, just a truth spoken plainly. But healing is rarely a straight road. That night, Nora dreamed of her past, the drunken husband who once called her worthless, the nights she lay awake wishing for kindness that never came. She woke with her heart pounding, tears on her cheeks. When Jonas arrived the next morning, she almost told him she couldn't do it, that the risk of opening her heart was too much. But then his daughter, the smallest one, ran up to her, wrapping tiny arms around her waist. "Will you come read to us tonight?" the child asked, eyes bright with hope. Nora froze. No one had asked her to read aloud since she was a girl teaching Sunday school. Her voice trembled. "If you'd like me to." That evening, she sat by their fire Bible, open in her lap, and read softly while the girls nestled against her. Her voice was rusty at first, but steadied as their eyes grew heavy with trust. When she looked up, Jonas was watching, not with pity, but with something deeper. It was the first time she thought, perhaps I belong here after all. Still, the town's cruelty had not fully disappeared. A week later, as she left the mercantile, 2 women whispered loud enough for her to hear. "Imagine nearly 50 and playing mother to another woman's children. Sad thing is, she thinks it's love." Nora's stomach knotted. She wanted to shrink, to vanish. But then she remembered Jonas's words. "Don't believe the voices that never mattered." For the first time, she lifted her chin and kept walking. Her heart trembled, but her steps did not falter. That night, she told Jonas about the whispers. He studied her face, then asked quietly, "And what did you do?" "I walked past," she said. Her voice shook, but there was a spark of pride in it. Jonas nodded once. "Good. You can't silence them, Nora, but you don't have to carry them either." She stared into the fire, realizing that perhaps strength didn't mean never being afraid. Perhaps it meant choosing to keep going, even with fear trailing close behind. The turning point came 2 weeks later during Sunday service. The preacher asked if anyone would lead the hymn, and a hush fell over the small congregation. No one volunteered. Then, to her own surprise, Nora heard her own voice. "I will." Gasps stirred, but she walked forward. Her hands trembled as she gripped the hymnal, but when she began to sing, her voice was clear, low, steady. It filled the wooden rafters, like water filling a dry well. She didn't sing for the townsfolk. She sang for the girl she once was, for the woman she had become, and for the life she was finally daring to claim. When the last note faded, the silence was thick. Then slowly the congregation joined in the next verse, voices blending with hers until the little church was alive with sound. Jonas sat in the pew, tears glistening in his eyes. His daughters clapped their small hands together, beaming with pride. For the first time, Nora felt the weight of shame begin to lift, not because the town had accepted her, but because she had accepted herself. That evening, Jonas walked her home. As they reached her porch, he said softly, "You've been fighting battles alone your whole life, Nora. Let me fight the rest with you." Her breath caught. She wanted to say yes, but words failed. Instead, she laid her hand gently over his. It was enough. Nora had finally begun to break the chains of shame, her voice rising where once it had been silenced. But could she truly believe she was worthy of love, not just from Jonas, but from herself? And what would happen when the next storm tested the fragile peace they were building? Summer unfurled across dry creek, warm winds bending the tall grass and carrying the scent of wild sage. Nora walked the path between her cabin and Jonas's ranch each day, sometimes with a basket of bread, sometimes with one of the younger girls holding her hand. The road no longer felt lonely. It felt worn in like a trail made for her feet. Jonas worked the fields with a steadiness that reminded her of the mountains, solid, unyielding, weathered, but still standing tall. He didn't speak often of feelings, but Nora had learned that love lived in the spaces between his silences, the way he sharpened her scissors without being asked, the way he left a lamp burning, when he knew she'd be walking home late, the way his hand brushed hers at the table, as if it had always belonged there. One evening, thunder rolled low across the plains. Storm clouds gathered black and restless. Jonas had been mending a section of fence when lightning cracked, sending the cattle into a frenzy. Nora saw him from the porch struggling to guide the herd away from the ravine. Her heart clenched. Without thinking, she grabbed a lantern and ran toward him, skirts heavy with rain. Together they worked Jonas shouting hoarsely, Nora waving the lantern to turn the cattle back towards safety. When at last the herd calmed, Jonas collapsed against the fence, soaked and breathless. Nora knelt beside him, pressing her hand to his arm. "You fool," she whispered, tears mixing with rain. "You would have let the storm take you." He met her eyes, his breath ragged but steady. "I wasn't afraid of the storm. I was afraid of leaving you behind." The words broke something open inside her. Years of doubt, of voices telling her she was unworthy, of nights spent alone with regret. All of it cracked and crumbled under the weight of one truth. Jonas saw her. Not her scars, not her age. Her. That night when the storm passed, he walked her home. At the porch, he paused, water dripping from his hair, his hands rough and trembling. "Nora," he said, "I don't have fancy words. I don't have riches. But I have this land, these children, and what's left of my heart, and I want you to share all of it with me." Her breath caught. The girl she once was might have doubted. The woman she had become only nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. Life did not transform overnight. The town still gossiped. Old fears still whispered in Nora's dreams. But there was a difference now. She no longer carried them alone. Jonas's daughters called her mama without hesitation, tugging her hands as they showed her drawings or brought her wildflowers. Jonas himself leaned on her laughter, her calm, her voice that could soften even the sharpest edges of his grief. One morning as she stood at the stove frying eggs, Nora realized she was humming a hymn she hadn't sung in years. Jonas looked up from mending a harness and smiled. It was not the weary smile of a man surviving. It was the steady smile of a man who had found home again. The years ahead would not be easy. Storms would come. Loss would visit again, as it always does. But Nora knew now that hope was not in the absence of sorrow. It was in the hands that held yours when the sorrow came. As she sat that evening with Jonas and the girls' firelight flickering on their faces, she thought of the child's voice that had once asked her, "Will you be my mama?" That whisper had changed everything. And Nora, 50 years old, weathered but unbroken, finally believed she had been chosen not as a second thought, not as a shadow, but as the very heart of a family. The prairie winds sighed against the walls, and for the first time in her long, wandering life, Nora smiled into the quiet and thought, "I am home." She was mocked for being too old, too broken, too late. But in the end, Nora discovered something timeless. Love doesn't arrive early or late. It arrives when two hearts are finally ready to receive it. And that made all the years of waiting worth it. In the end, Nora's story reminds us of something we too often forget. Life does not measure worth by age, beauty, or what others expect of us. It measures worth by kindness given, love shared, and courage carried quietly through the hardest years. She had been mocked, dismissed, and left behind, yet a single child's whisper showed her that she was still needed, still chosen, still capable of giving and receiving love. And when a man with a steady heart later stood beside her, it wasn't out of pity but out of recognition. He saw the dignity she had carried all along. For those of us listening, there's a lesson here. No matter how many seasons of loss or rejection we've endured, the possibility of love in all its forms is never gone. Sometimes it comes not as a grand gesture, but as a small question, a gentle glance, or a hand held in silence. And when it does, it reminds us that we are not too late, not too old, not too broken. We are still worthy of being loved exactly as we are. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us here at None. Wild West Saga. Subscribe to the channel, share this tale with someone who might need a little hope today, and leave a comment below. Tell us, would you like to hear more stories like Nora's, or perhaps a continuation of hers? Because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that heal us most.